Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And thank you to my colleague Afroz Saab for inviting me. Um, I come sometimes to Hyderabad. I've been to the Hyderabad University, I've been to FLU, but I've never had a chance to visit this campus before, so I'm very, very happy to be here today. I was asked by Professor Alam to speak about the relevance of Ambedkar in contemporary India. And I wanted to, I can talk about the relevance of Ambedkar in contemporary India at any time, but I really wanted to tailor that and make that question sharper to try to think about why Ambedkar or whether Ambedkar might be relevant to an audience such as your own, right? To the kind of people who are studying at this university, to the communities from which you come, to this part of the country, to this regional context, to this political context. Why would you be interested in Ambedkar? That was the question which I asked myself. We all know he's a historical figure and he's important in the history of modern India, in the political life of modern India, in a very general sort of way. But is there any relevance of Ambedkar, for example, for the Muslim community? Is there any relevance of Ambedkar for non-Dalit minorities? Is there any relevance in South India as opposed to in Maharashtra or in North India or in some other part of the country? I think our political reality today is so divided and so fractured that we can't even take for granted that somebody like Ambedkar is relevant necessarily to all Indians. Just like we can't take it for granted that somebody like Gandhi is relevant to all Indians, or Nehru is relevant, or even for that matter, Maulana Azad is relevant, outside of these very, very small contexts where we try to stay true to the historical record and try to remember and remain aware about the values and the norms according to which this democracy was created and this nation state was created in 1947 or in 1950 with the promulgation of the Constitution. So I really mean to raise this question in a significant way. I don't just want to tell you why Ambedkar is relevant. पहले ठीक था नहीं? ठीक था। पहले ठीक था, आपने क्या किया? So I want to raise this question in this particular room, in this particular university, in this particular context, and I want it to be a meaningful question. Right? I want you to think about whether Ambedkar is relevant to you or not, whether the name means anything to you or not, and to see whether I can persuade you, not just because I think he's important, not just because I'm writing a life of Ambedkar, but because he represents certain questions, he stands for certain values, and he introduces certain themes into our political life, which are of relevance to all of us today. So as we know, India today is increasingly becoming majoritarian, right? I don't think it's becoming majoritarian. I think it has become majoritarian, even within the last few years, right before our eyes. And that means that our constitutional commitment to secularism, to justice, to equal rights and equal citizenship for all communities, for all castes, for all genders, for all regions, for all linguistic groups, that constitutional commitment is under some kind of question mark. And this question mark is not coming from the people, it's coming from the state, which is what is worrying. I mean, there's always been a contestation between different communities, there's always been a give and take, a push and pull, and power fluctuates in how it is shared among different communities. That's part of democracy, that's how democracy is. But what has changed in the last few years is that the structures of the state and of government themselves, using the electoral mandate, have begun to test the foundations of the constitutional commitment to secularism and to equal rights. Right? That is what I mean by the threat of majoritarianism becoming more and more real in contemporary India. So, what does this mean? And I'm sure you all know exactly what this means. But it means that India is becoming more violent, it is becoming more divided, it is becoming more unsafe for women, it's becoming a place where minorities, especially Muslims and Christians, I would say, Dalits, tribals, women, children, are becoming more vulnerable. And of course, economic disparities are also increasing, and vulnerabilities caused by a poor distribution of economic growth, those are also increasing. The gap between the rich and the poor is increasing. So, in this atmosphere of increasing marginalization and vulnerability, you also have, while democracy is robust in the sense that you have regular elections, and my colleague Sanjay, I think, came and spoke to you just last week about electoral politics, and we know that we have elections, they are regular, they are mostly free and fair, and democracy in one sense electorally is functional and fine. At the same time, we know that apart from the ruling party, the opposition is now very weak. We know that the judiciary is increasingly becoming quite divided and compromised and not acting necessarily as the last bastion for preserving constitutional values. Right? We know that democracy itself is becoming illiberal, and the sort of models of governance are becoming less participatory and more authoritarian. Right? And this is something which we all experience in our everyday life. I don't think it's not unique to any community. This is something that all people of all communities experience, I think in a very sharp way over the last few years. So in this climate, now the question is, why and how can Ambedkar specifically be relevant? Right? Does Ambedkar have anything to do with pushing back against majoritarianism? Right? Does Ambedkar have anything special to tell us when there is a crisis of justice? Right? When there is a crisis in secularism, is Ambedkar going to be of assistance to us? Or should we look elsewhere for guidance and for help at a time of what feels like a crisis in constitutional values? I think it's fair to say that Ambedkar is probably the strongest clearest voice that stood up for the rights of the weak and the vulnerable and the marginal in 20th century India. He was, of course, the leader of the untouchables, but as the effective author of the Constitution, as somebody who played an authorial and an editorial role in drafting the Constitution, a leadership role in even creating a constitution for independent India. He was the biggest advocate of equality and justice that we have had in our modern history. And if you look at the preamble to the Constitution, which everyone should know, it's only really one sentence actually, right? That we the people, right, give to ourselves this Constitution, which guarantees to all Indians. What is the first item on that? It's justice, right? It's not freedom, it's not liberty, it's not equality, it's not fraternity. The first item listed in the preamble to the Constitution is justice, right? And this is Ambedkar's contribution. This is something which Ambedkar made possible, right? Because he recognized that in spite of achieving political independence, in spite of achieving Swaraj from British Raj, right? In spite of liberty becoming the basis for the very birth of this new Indian nation out of the British Empire, right? This new nation did not yet have the conditions of social equality, right? The social structure continued to be hierarchical and unequal, and to treat men and women differently, and to treat upper castes and lower castes differently, and to treat members of different communities and different regions as essentially not equal to one another, but arranged according to a complex system of hierarchy and differentiation, which Ambedkar understood as the caste system. But as we all know, caste system is not confined to Hindu society. Caste system essentially means that your basic social structure is a structure of inequality, right? Of hierarchy and differentiation, right? In which all members are deprived of a basic fundamental equality and respect, right? Everyone. Doesn't matter whether you're Muslim or you're Hindu or you're Christian or you're Sikh or you're Buddhist or you're tribal, you become part of an overall system which does not treat equality as a basic fundamental given of the way in which humans politically organize themselves, especially in a democracy, right? So you achieved political independence through the national movement, through the struggle for Swaraj, through Gandhian methods, through the kind of defeat, in a sense, of the British Empire, the end of imperialism, decolonization, right? You've established a new nation on the principle of equal citizenship and universal adult franchise. Everybody gets to vote, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you have property or you don't, whether you are a high caste or low caste, no matter which religion you belong to, all Indians have the vote from the first day, right? But you are unleashing this promise of democracy in a society, in a social context which is still not at all habituated to thinking about egalitarian and just norms that will govern our social and political and economic life, right? It's not an equal society. It may be a free society, but it's not an equal society. So recognizing this, because Ambedkar represents the weakest of the weak, right? Because he stands for the outcasts, the untouchables, because he is the leader of the Dalits, right? And he comes from that social background and he has experienced this kind of inequality firsthand, right? He recognizes that political freedom is not a guarantee of a truly equal society. Therefore, in order to fully realize that liberty, that freedom, that independence, in order to build a truly democratic society, you need instruments of social justice. Right? You need all of the apparatuses of the state. You need a commitment to positive discrimination, to affirmative action, to reservations policy. You need to understand that there has historically been injustice against certain communities, and that overnight they are not going to overcome that handicap of hundreds of years of discrimination. Right? Now, when we speak about social justice, we usually think only about members of what Ambedkar would call the depressed classes, right? Which means those who are low down in the caste hierarchy, or those who are outside of the caste system and are considered to be, at that time, untouchable. So one of the first things that the Constitution does is abolish and legalize the practice, the thought, the idea of untouchability, right? That is enshrined in the Constitution, right? It gives equal citizenship and the vote to everyone, and equal rights to everyone, and those are inalienable rights. You cannot be deprived of those rights if you are an Indian citizen by the law. But over and above that, the Constitution also tries to take care of communities that have been historically discriminated against. Now, the situation of Dalits and the situation of Muslims historically is quite different, right? As you know, Islam has been in India as long as Islam has been in the world, almost, right? And there have been Muslims in the subcontinent for centuries. There have been Muslim kingdoms, there have been Islamic states, there have been big and small empires, there have been Muslim elites, Muslim ruling classes, and Muslim cultures all over India are highly variegated by religion, by region, I beg your pardon. They may be united by religion, but they are highly varied and diverse according to regional subcultures, right? So Muslims in Kashmir are very different from Muslims in Kerala, or Muslims in Maharashtra are very different from Muslims in Bengal, and this is something that we all know. Also based on the kind of languages that we speak, and everything else that follows in our kitchens, in our homes, in our lived everyday life, and in our culture, right? And even within Islam, you have so many different kinds of Islam, so many different sects and schools, and different bodies of practice and doctrine which prevail in a mind-boggling diversity all over the subcontinent, right? So why is it that at the time of independence, suddenly Muslims in India become just another minority, or perhaps the largest minority, but essentially a minority which suggests that there is some shortfall in the equality of their citizenship, right? And this is, of course, a function of partition, right? That we have created a Muslim homeland, and now we have the Indian nation, which is not a Hindu homeland on paper, which is not symmetrical to the principle on which we have created the state of Pakistan. But nonetheless, we find that suddenly the Muslims of India are reduced in their capacity to exercise their rights and to claim equal citizenship. And this marginalization has only been increasing over the last 70 years. It has never actually reached a level where it becomes immaterial what your religion is, which should have happened if it was a truly actively, proactively secular polity, right? That through all the protections, through all the sort of special dispensations, through all the forms of positive discrimination, through all the care that is taken for all the marginal and weak communities, according to the Constitution, it should have happened by now that Dalits were better off than they were 70 years ago, that Muslims were better off than they were 70 years ago, that women were better off than they are 70 years ago, that tribals were better off. But actually none of this has happened. And all these communities are worse off than they were. Right? And that's why we need Ambedkar. Because Ambedkar could foresee this. Right? He could foresee that as long as this remains a deeply divided and essentially unequal society, simply having political freedom or having political democracy, even having the vote and the election system, is not going to be enough. Right, to make up for centuries of difference, of conflict, of hierarchy, and of the active exclusion and marginalization of so many communities, especially, of course, in his case, the Dalits and other depressed classes. Right. So, I was reading about Ambedkar's life, and he said somewhere that he's talking to somebody who's very close to him, who's not like a well-known political figure, not somebody important in public life, but somebody who remembers spending a lot of time with Ambedkar. And Ambedkar one day says to him, Ambedkar had very poor health. He died fairly young, and he died of diabetes, and in the last years of his life, he was extremely unwell in the 1950s. And he says, I am a tent pole in a circus tent. You know what a circus tent looks like? It's like this large shamiana, right? And it has this... तंबू नहीं होता? तंबू समझते हैं ना? शामियाना. तो उसको खड़ा करने के लिए आपको कई सारे डंडे चाहिए, ना? तो उसका जो बीच वाला पिलर है, वो कहते हैं कि मैं वो हूँ. I am the tent pole of a circus tent. If I collapse, अगर मैं बीमार हो गया या मैं मर गया या मुझे कुछ हो गया, तो ये सारा का सारा तंबू गिर जाएगा. Right? This entire tent will collapse if I collapse, he says. Right? And that is indeed what has happened. Right? That there has never been a Dalit leadership. There has never been a figure of the stature of Ambedkar after Ambedkar. There has never been a nationwide Dalit movement. There has never been a political party. There has never been a representation or a voice with that kind of command of authority and respect, right? And the entire project of Dalit emancipation, in a sense, collapsed. We are now trying to build it up again, but for a long time after Ambedkar, right, that struggle was highly compromised by his own absence, right, from the scene. So, too much, in a sense, hinges on this one figure. There's too much stress on Ambedkar as a symbol, as a teacher, as a guide, as this person who's educating you, who's organizing you, who's mobilizing you, who's trying to show you the way to the future, who's writing the Constitution. I mean, how much historical burden can you put on one figure, right? At the end of the day, the communities which are affected the most, whose lives are impacted by this extreme inequality of our social order, they have to take the initiative that we will not tolerate this anymore. We will resist and we will fight back and we will dissent and we will build, right? And we will put forward our claims and we will make sure that the state responds to our needs, because the state has failed to do that in a systematic sense, despite the Constitution, right? So what is true for Ambedkar is also true for Muslims, I think, right? For the Muslim leadership in India, which has been absolutely lacking post-partition. Of course, there are reasons for this in partition itself, in that so much of the Muslim ruling elite and the intellectual classes simply went and became Pakistanis. But at the same time, enough time has passed that we need the Muslim voice to express itself and to articulate its own needs in a way that has not been happening at all of late. And this is not to blame the victim. This is not to say that Dalits are responsible for their own sorry state, or that Muslims are backward because, they don't speak up. That's not what one is trying to say. What one is trying to say is that in a competitive electoral democracy based on debate and dissension and disagreement, right, where different communities are lobbying for better resources, for better self-representation, for their own interests in a very, very diverse and complex field, right? At the end of the day, identity has to be not just about victimhood. It also has to be about positive efforts that are made to claim what is rightfully yours. Of course, it is rightfully yours on paper, but you know the reality. If it's not coming to you, you have to come out there and take it, make it your own, right? There has to be a stronger claim on the future of India as such by all marginalized and all vulnerable communities, right? And that is something which I think Ambedkar can serve as a signpost. Ambedkar can serve as an example, as a reminder, right? But there are limits to what you can expect the mere name of Ambedkar to produce in a continuously changing political environment, where the pressures are extreme also from the other side, right? As India becomes more and more majoritarian. So I've been reading these sort of, people reminiscing, remembering Ambedkar because of their personal interaction with him. And there's this one occasion when some American journalists have come and they want to meet him. This is in that period during the drafting of the Constitution between 46 and 49. And they say, what time should we come and meet you? And he says, come anytime. Why does he say that? Because he stays awake the whole night reading and writing. He works all day and he stays up all night. And he says, just come anytime. And they say, why can't you give us an appointment? And we're coming to interview you. Nehru gave us an appointment and Gandhiji gave us an appointment, and we can't go to their house very late at night because they'll be sleeping. And he says, well, they can sleep because their followers are awake. But I can't sleep because my followers are all asleep. Right? So I have to remain vigilant. I have to remain alert. I have to think of everything. That's the kind of burden that he feels. Right? कि हमारे जो लोग हैं वो सो रहे हैं, मतलब उनको जगाना जो है वो मैं नहीं कर पाया हूँ. दिस इज़ व्हाट ही इज़ ट्राइंग टू कन्वे. मुझे खुद ही जागे रहना पड़ता है कि मैं दिन रात इसमें जुटा हुआ हूँ कि मैं किस तरह से इन लोगों को जगाऊँ. राइट, हाउ टू मोबिलाइज दिस कम्युनिटी, हाउ टू मेक इट अंडरस्टैंड दैट इट इज़ अ पॉलिटिकल कम्युनिटी. Right? It's not just a religious community, it's not just a ritual identity, it's not just a relic of the past, right? That it's something political. That is what it means to be Dalit, right? The very word Dalit suggests this. What does Dalit mean? जिसका दलन हुआ हो, which is crushed, right? उसको पीस के मतलब उसका छोटा छोटा पीस किया गया हो, right? That is Dalit, right? अब इस शब्द से आपको क्या समझ में आता है कि एक शोषण हुआ है किसी एक तबके का, और उसके बाद उसका जो गुस्सा है, उसकी जो नाराज़गी है, वो आपको समझनी है. इसीलिए इस शब्द का इस्तेमाल करते हैं. हरिजन नहीं कहते या कोई और शब्द नहीं कहते हैं. SC ST कहते हैं तो उससे भी हमें कुछ खास समझ में नहीं आता है. जो उनकी मानसिक स्थिति है उसके बारे में आपको कुछ समझ में नहीं आएगा. आप SC ST कहेंगे तो SC ST से तो आपको ये समझ में आएगा कि आपका इतना परसेंटेज पॉइंट यहाँ मिलेगा, इतना आप रिजर्वेशन ले सकते हैं, यहाँ पे आपकी एडमिशन होगी या नहीं, ये नौकरी आपको मिलेगी या नहीं, आपके ट्रेन के टिकट का ये प्राइस होगा, ये सब चीज़ आप समझ सकते हैं उससे. But what is the political emotion that you associate with a word like Dalit? It is anger, right? It is resistance. It is the condition of being historically oppressed that you have to then fight back against, right? Now, I don't know what similar situation there is among Muslims in India. I don't think at this moment there is anything. I think there is simply a feeling of being demoralized and defeated and divided, right? And being unable to really do much. And in that sense, remembering Ambedkar is something which is very, very helpful. Not because Muslims have the same issues as Dalits, but because there has to be a natural solidarity of the oppressed. There has to be an alliance between all those who are oppressed by something which is a common structure of power, right? From which we are all excluded. As a woman, I am excluded. I mean, I may be called Ananya Vajpayee, but as a woman, the issues which I face are similar to what other women face, no matter what community they belong to, right? And similarly with region and with religion and with caste, right? So our basis for understanding our identity has to be our political condition, not just the accident of our birth. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Does that make sense to you? Are you able to relate to it? This is something which Ambedkar struggled to communicate. Now, I recently visited Aurangabad, and in Aurangabad I was invited by the Baba Saheb Ambedkar Marathwada University to speak about Ambedkar and majoritarianism. Actually, that's what I was invited to speak about. And I was very interested to see that there was no Marathwada University was established in 1958, and the foundation stone was laid by Jawaharlal Nehru, and Ambedkar died in 1956, so this was after his death. But way back in the early mid 1940s, Ambedkar went to Aurangabad, this is before independence, and he found this land which actually belonged to the Nizam of Hyderabad. Right, that time this region was Marathwada was actually what became Marathwada was part of the Nizam state, and it was not part of Maharashtra. There was no Maharashtra, of course. So all that happened later. So he personally, through his own money, he bought a very large piece of land, right? And he took a debt. He remained in debt to the end of his life because he bought this land, and he established something called Milind College. Right? Milind is a figure from the history and the literature of Buddhism. It's a canonical figure in the kind of Buddhist memory. So he called it Milind College. He established Milind College, and the idea of Milind College, he supervised the building of this Milind College, which you can go and see today. It's 2 colleges of arts and sciences. Beautiful campus, and it's made in this kind of hybrid Buddhist European style, right? So he was also thinking of all the universities in the United States and in England and in Europe where he had studied or where he had visited. But there were also elements of Buddhist architecture. So there are these kind of dome-like, stupa-like structures, right? And it's beautifully made. It's very, very open. They've preserved it like that and planted lots of trees and all this. And in Milind College, he wanted specially to make provisions for the education of depressed classes, right? That this is where people who are not allowed to enter schools and colleges, who are discriminated against in schools and colleges in the rest of India, they should be able to come here and study here and get an education, right? And later on, Marathwada University was created, and Milind College became the kind of cornerstone of the entire Marathwada University, right, which is now one of the biggest universities in India, right? But that vision, right, for that mandate, that there is a community which has been deprived of educational opportunities, and we need to create a campus, we need to create space where they too can come and study any of the liberal arts or the humanities or the sciences, right? That, to create that capacity, he didn't wait for the state, it was still the colonial state at that time, right? He didn't even wait for the independent Indian nation state. He went ahead and did this on his own, right, with whatever money he had. And he took a lot of his books. Ambedkar had around 50,000 books in his personal library. He took about 1,500 of these books and he established the Milind College Library. I went to see it just about 4 weeks ago. And what a collection of books, amazing collection of books on all subjects, in so many languages, from all traditions of religious, different, he had books on the Bible, he had books on Islam, he had books on Buddhism, he had books on all the Hindu scriptures, Kabir, on the Bhakti movement, books in Marathi, books in Pali, books in English, all the European literature. He had everything from Sartre to Nietzsche to Marx to, T.S. Eliot to all of political theory, political economy, anthropology, all these things, Buddhism, right, economics, everything in his library. And he just put it there in the middle of nowhere. I mean, what is Aurangabad? It's just a tiny little place, right? Long time ago, it used to be Daulatabad and all this, right? But he bought this land where he could afford to buy the land. He established his library, established his college. And then it became later on one of the big universities of central India, right? And I was again reading. So when I went to the library, the librarian showed me a rare scroll of the Quran, of the Holy Quran, which Ambedkar owned, which he gave to the library, and it was illuminated with gold. So it's very old and it kind of unfurls like this, and it's painted very delicately. It's like a medieval scroll. And today I was reading that Ambedkar actually paid 8,000 rupees. Can you imagine? 8,000 rupees somewhere in around 1945 or something to purchase this tiny Quran, right? And they still keep it like a treasure. The librarian has it in the drawer, and he takes it out for special visitors, and he showed it to me. So he had a passion for books, right? And I was very, very moved by my visit to this place. And I was thinking about when I'm going to come here, right? Why do you have an Aligarh Muslim University? Why do you have a Jamia Millia Islamia, right? Why do you have a Maulana Azad National Urdu University, right? Why do we need these institutions? Why do you have the Baba Saheb Ambedkar Marathwada University, right? We have minority institutions in this country, and we should have minority institutions in this country, I say. That is part of India's secular commitment. This is not minority protection, right? This is not playing into the hands of the victim psychology and the blackmail of various kinds of marginal communities. No. We need those spaces because the so-called religion-blind state, the so-called secular state, the so-called civil society, the so-called equal citizenship is not actually including and not actually giving the basic respect and basic opportunities to so many different communities in this country. That's why we need those institutions, right? And if we have them, we have to value them, and we have to use them to the best of our ability. And we have to take every opportunity that is there, every provision that is there, right? And we have to build ourselves to a new strength, to a position of strength. Because unless you develop that voice, unless you have that tent pole, the tent will collapse, right? That's what Ambedkar was saying. So he spent so much of his energy on education. Actually, he spent far more energy on education than he spent on politics. He was not a very successful politician, if you look at Ambedkar's life. He was not a mass leader in the way that a Gandhi was or a Nehru was. He did not enjoy that kind of popularity with the masses, right? He could not easily win an election, right? But his methods were different and his belief was different. His belief was that you must educate, you must organize, and you must mobilize the backward sections of society. And that is the vision behind an institution, I believe, I don't know, I haven't read the mandate of this university, but I would imagine that that is the kind of vision that produces a space of this kind, where you are all sitting and where you are, reading your various subjects and getting your undergraduate and your graduate degrees and becoming the leaders of your community and of the life worlds from which you come and which you bring to the table. So, I would like us to think about how we can connect. When we ask a question like, what is the relevance of Ambedkar in contemporary India, that's not just a very bland, banal question. What is the relevance of Rabindranath Tagore in contemporary India, and what is the relevance of anybody? What is the relevance? There's no relevance until we take away the meaning from what somebody like Ambedkar was trying to do by way of achieving social justice, by way of creating a social revolution to parallel the political revolution through which India achieved independence. Right? That message has to be understood and made one's own, which it can be done even by Muslims. It doesn't just have to be done by Dalits. In fact, it has to be done by everybody if this democracy is to be truly democratic, if this republic is to be truly secular, and if this constitution has to truly survive the kind of danger that it faces from the onslaught of majoritarian nationalism. Thank you so much.